Hey, Kev.
Hey, how are you doing?
I'm good. And you?
Okay, good, good.
Yep,
Can't
yep.
complain.
All right. So we're finishing up John Dominick Crossan's Render unto Caesar, the last section here, part three, which talks about the writings of Flavius, Flavor Flav, Josephus. His mission is to clarify, that Jewish people can be Roman citizens, even though there's all this stuff in the history that he's got to clean up a little bit where there's no god but god kind of stuff where like our god is Yahweh, so we can't accept the authority of Caesar. So sort of the coin behind me was apparently printed, and this is where the whole render unto Caesar controversy comes up. And you had to pay tribute, you had to pay taxes in these Roman coins, which is why you had to change your money. And they wanted you to do your commercial endeavors with these Roman coins as well. So it was a way of establishing dominion, and so it also established kind of a revolutionary spirit in some of the Jews and in the communities there, and so that they felt like, you know, they had to refuse to pay their taxes to Rome, because that was a way of refusing Roman authority, because they only had one God, one ruler, and Caesar was not it. Good.
Yeah,
The third way, which is just like
yeah,
nonviolent resistance. So the first two ways would be peace under violence, the Pax
yes.
Romana. The second way would be just total non-resistance, which would just be like whatever goes. And then the third way is peaceful or nonviolent resistance. So, as opposed to just straight up non-resistance. Josephus wants to say that, first of all, those violent revolutionaries are not us.
In chapter 11, the historian Josephus describes how first century Jewish society responded to Roman rule, focusing on two main points he denies about Jewish resistance. First, Josephus rejects the idea that Jewish resistance was driven by a holy God given mission or a messianic leader. Instead, he argues that Rome's military victories proved God was actually on the Roman side,
Hmm.
making any revolt an act against God himself. Second, Josephus downplays the existence of organized, philosophy driven Jewish nonviolent resistance. However, historical evidence shows that between the major armed revolts of 4 BCE and 66 CE, Jewish communities actively practiced strategic large-scale nonviolent resistance, a form of organized activism backed by a collective willingness to face martyrdom rather than accepted imperial control, to challenge Roman authority without resorting to violence. When you were talking, I thought it was interesting how there were armed revolts between or around 4 BCE and 66 CE. It's like 4 BCE, that's close to the birth of Christ, or the narrative
Right.
of the birth of Christ. And 66 CE just seems like a lot of things were being written down about the Christian faith. Like I think of like the Gospel of Mark and maybe some of Paul's letters. And I wonder if now Josephus started writing around. Uh,
Josephus wrote his major works roughly over 3 decades. The Jewish War was written between 75 and 79 CE about the revolt in Jerusalem,
right.
and then the Jewish antiquities were written later, around 93 to 94 CE.
Yeah.
So a much longer history about this is the one we're talking about most in this conversation, because it's a
Hmm.
lot of information about various Jewish sects, denominations, however you want to put that, where you kind of get that. And then he wrote his uh, own life story, I guess you could say, in 93 and 94, just
Yeah.
his own experience as a, because he was, he also wanted to justify the fact that he was considered kind of a traitor, because he, had been a part of the revolt and then
Hmm.
went ahead and, became a um, apologist for Rome afterwards. So it
Yeah.
seemed, from some people's perspective on that, he was kind of a turncoat.
Yeah, and I wonder, back to like how Luke possibly used his sources to write the book of Acts. Well, I just wonder in general, like if they had the same sources, because Luke compiled a lot of these, stories or teachings with people that he ran, he talked with
Yeah,
apparently. And I wonder if
yeah.
Josephus maybe had the same experience.
Yeah, you wonder what sources
Yeah,
anybody had, really. I mean,
right.
so like modern scholarship claims, that Luke for the Gospels had Mark and that Matthew also had Mark and
Hmm.
Q, or, just like accumulated documents, or oral traditions or whatever Q was. And then that they also had some of the early letters of Paul, because there's overlap between figures in Acts and figures in Josephus's Antiquities. And so the question was like, was one aware of the other or not? I mean, Josephus in many ways was in the heart of a lot of it, so it might have been just like oral stuff where he was just ear to the ground, kind of reporting reporting out.
Yeah, right.
But unwittingly, I guess you could say, Josephus shows that there is this third way. Not He's not advocating it, by the way.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right. It
he's
was
just he's
unintended.
yeah,
It was
that's right.
unattended. Yeah,
Yeah, unintended consequences, if you will,
yeah,
of his trying to
right.
show like these other groups, as you read in your summary, these other groups were just like kookballs, and there were small, disorganized bands, and like their leaders were zealots, and they were rightly suppressed by Roman authorities, and their followers are basically disbanded at this point. So you
Right.
don't need to worry about us. Basically, we're not gonna revolt or whatever. Which he's writing before the Bar Kokhba revolts. Which kind of would have disproven some of his claims of the
Hmm.
Jewish community still being harmless or whatever. So there were
Yeah.
still a lot of strains of sort of like violent revolution um, within the Jewish community.
Instead of the biblical hope of peace through nonviolent justice, Josephus proclaims peace through violent victory, which kind of goes along with Rome, the idea of just, establishing peace by the sword, so to speak. Another quote I have: Jewish nonviolent resistance was not pacifism, but activism, not just internal, but external, not just individual and personal, but large scale and organized. It was a programmatic, non-violent response to violent imperial domination. God is on Rome's side, bringing peace through the sword,
Yep.
whereas these some Jewish groups were saying that we need to bring peace by peaceful means.
Yeah, and he was John Dominick Crossan was concerned that people would think that he was being anachronistic by projecting backwards, non the concept of nonviolence, which is supposedly a relatively modern concept in many ways, developed during the I guess the decolonization movement in India under Gandhi's tutelage, and then taken from there by Martin Luther King Jr., and developed as the concept of passive resistance. So you see in passive resistance, you see the passivity, which is mean the commitments to not be violent, and then the resistance part, which is the commitment to not back down at the same time.
Yeah, yeah, and it's something that I see in the Mennonite tradition as well. Not only having a tradition of being separatist, there was during their history, and now it's just an act of passive resistance
Hmm.
in how they live. And I think you also see like that conflict among Christianity, and as far as in America, is there's some groups that are like almost pro-war,
Yeah,
I
right.
think you see it within our politics, and then you see other segments of Christianity in this country where it's like we need to be um, activist, and obviously you saw that during the civil rights movement, and I remember reading Leo Tolstoy. Some of his writings were influenced by, or Leo Tolstoy influenced Gandhi
Mm.
with the idea of passive resistance, as well as Martin Luther King was influenced by Gandhi, I think. Yeah, it was just
All of
kind of
whom
interesting.
introduced, all of whom were influenced by Jesus of Nazareth. So,
There we go.
yeah,
Because Leo
yeah,
Tolstoy
that's
was,
right.
I think, was East. I think Leo Tolstoy was Orthodox. I think he was because he was
Yeah,
Russian.
right.
I think, yeah, he
Yeah.
was definitely influenced by
No,
that.
he definitely
So,
got it from the turn the other cheek thing, but turn the other
yeah,
cheek can sound like just passivity.
yes,
You have to add the passive resistance bit, and then Gandhi really developed this idea of the resistance part as being a very so the first word passivity is contradicted by the word activity, so that he really thought of this as an active passivity.
hmm,
So
right,
so that you're
right,
bringing it to them, you're like
yeah,
forcing a confrontation. So and then Dr. King, of course, that's what he did. He put southern authorities, northern authorities too, in the spotlight by forcing confrontations, not by backing down, but at the same time refusing to fight back. And Pettus Bridge is a great example of forcing a kind of showdown, if you will,
hmm,
and then showing the corrupt government of the ruling authorities at the time, and their violence, just bringing that out. And then the most controversial Dr. King move, of course, was the Children's March, in which the fire hoses Birmingham were brought out on the
hmm,
children. That was under Bull Connor, I think, and so you show, and it was very controversial at the time because it was like, how dare you put children in harm's way like this?
yeah,
Um, but like he felt so strongly that the images of you know, doing this to children would really force out the sort of like violence of the South, who had no problem
yeah,
lynching children. But for
yeah,
example, one of the kind of precursors to all of the civil rights movement, or some people would say the beginning, is the Emmett Till
hmm,
case, which is
yeah,
was a which is it was a child who was lynched. So it's like taking that sort of like Southern lynching culture and putting it on display for everybody else to see
yeah.
just what it is, how
It,
raw
it's
and awful
it's
it is.
almost like holding a mirror to
Yeah.
your opponents,
Hmm.
where it's like this is what you're doing. This is,
Right.
you know, and obviously the same thing with the cross. Um,
Yeah, because it is the violence of
yeah,
Rome, even though, like as we saw in this book in Luke and Acts, but in other places in the Gospels, where they try to make it the violence of the Jews. And so, why does
yeah,
Luke want to do that? Why does he want to make it the violence of the Jews rather than Roman violence? And John Dominick Crossan is very clear. This is a Roman form of torture. This is like
right,
this was done with under Roman authority, or
yeah,
whatever. Like all this, like Pilate washing his hands and like handing him over to the Jews and all
yeah,
this other kind of stuff, and the Jews shouting for the death of Jesus, like totally belies, and as an attempt to belie, like Roman violence. I mean, so
hmm,
like the Pax Romana, violence through, peace through violence is violence.
hmm.
And you have to show that, like, that there is no way to, and John Dominic Crossan mentions a bunch of times how, violence begets violence, and that's part of what Jesus is trying
So
to show.
bringing peace through a war that you started is still violence. Is that what you said? That doesn't happen today.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so out of the whole just war theory, one of the things you get is this idea is like, is a preemptive strike ever
Mm,
justified? So, under just war theory, which really gets developed once, Christians become predominant in Rome. But then the just war theory had to come up because they had to figure out some kind of position between the two, because it was very clear the turn the other cheek crap and the being crucified on the cross stuff was like really hard to like make consonant with to reduce that level of that contradiction and like some sort of consonance was like really a tough move. I guess turn point things is like, okay, in self-defense it's okay. Well, that's already, according to John Dominick Crossan, not nonviolent resistance. So, nonviolent resistance is, yeah, it includes not defending yourself, but it doesn't mean being totally passive. So you are like, in a sense, defending your beliefs, your life. You're defending yourself, but not by violence, by actual spiritual power, or what Gandhi called soul power. What Gandhi actually called
yeah,
soul power and became called soul power in the civil rights movement as well, not by your the violence of your hands. Kind of formulation of just violence, at the line being self-defense. But
yeah,
now the next question becomes this like preemptive action, like to
right. Which is
establish
not
peace.
just war. Which,
I mean, I think the first like full systematic, programmatic, whatever you want to call it, articulation of just war is Augustine, and then probably Martin of
yeah,
Tours.
mostly in churches, I think, like just different groups of churches. You see that difference. Like I've been part of churches where like they don't even talk about politics. They just kind of assimilate, acculturate in their society, in their communities. And then you have others that are just really kind of Christian nationalists, and then you have others that are activists.
It kind
I
of
mean,
maps onto, I don't know about the
it,
Christian nationalists. That doesn't seem to map onto anything in the Bible. But if you were going to map, if
well,
you were going to, sorry,
yeah.
go
Well,
ahead. Yeah.
I mean, the idea of like revelation, kind of like
Yeah, maybe. Yeah,
like
that's what I
it's
was going to say. If it maps
yeah,
onto anything, it
yeah,
would be John of Patmos, Revelation,
right,
except that even in Revelation, there's no Christian like human warriors. God does all the
right.
fighting. Jesus does all
That's
the
true.
fighting. So it's like
Yeah.
there's no need for you to do anything. You're waiting for God to do that kind of a thing. So it's
Hmm.
it's just hard to map it there. But like very clearly, most would map onto a kind of Luke and Acts accommodationalist idea here. And then once it's adopted by the Roman Empire, you've got to figure out a way to continue to be on top and rule, and there's no imagining ruling over without violence, without the force of violence. And so you've got to then go back and hedge on, or like change the way you take Jesus's teaching. So
And
whatever he meant by turning
yeah,
the other cheek, or turn the other cheek, or whatever he meant, he couldn't have meant just sit there and take it. So then you move to the next step, which is like legitimate self-defense. But like the thing about self-defense
yeah,
and violence, and this is John Dominic Crossan's entire point about violence. And I'm not, and I am like, let me just say right now, I in my own life am like for self-defense, like or whatever. Like if somebody, I'm not turning the other
yeah,
cheek or whatever, to especially defend my family, whatever. So like I'm not
yeah,
saying, I'm not trying to promote it or like look down on folks who think there's something wrong with that. But John Dominic Crossan's point is, if once you start with the violence, there's a way to always extend it. It just begets itself. And then now it's that we go into places. For example, I mean, one of the examples of preemptive strikes for a long time in just war theory and modern just war theory was if you saw a enemy power that was like tooling for war, getting ready for war, and you knew if you struck first, you could prevent a lot of that. And in the current example, the claim is that we're in Iran because
right.
we it's a preemptive strike against them obtaining nuclear weapons. It's very clear as this thing goes down that it has nothing to do with preventing somebody from having nuclear weapons or whatever. But like
Yeah,
that was
then yeah,
always
yeah,
the paradox, that like the preemptive strike was supposed to kind of like thought experiment that it was supposed to make you think about. Like,
And I
for
wonder if
example,
that's,
if you could kill Hitler,
yeah,
would you have like assassinated
exactly.
baby Hitler and all that kind of shit
Right.
that constantly comes
Yeah.
up? Is just like unbelievable.
Right.
But like that's the whole thing with violence. It's like,
Yeah.
where is the line?
And I think that's where it comes from, maybe, is I'm not a historian, but where World War II. I mean, it just got totally out of hand. This guy who was going to take over all of Europe. Um,
Yeah. And
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 so the
because he
idea
was
of,
appeased and
right,
he wasn't directly confronted,
right.
and
We tried to
he got out of
we
control,
tried to
right?
accommodate. We tried to. I think I read. I think the prime minister before Churchill met
Chamberlain,
with
yeah,
him,
famous,
Chamberlain,
yeah,
and was like tried to. Oh, he's. It's okay. It's going to be
yeah,
okay. You
yeah,
know,
yeah.
we talked through some things,
Yeah, there's a
and
very famous picture of Chamberlain coming off the plane from from that
yeah,
conference saying, peace in our time. And
right,
and everybody's
and
like, what a fool. So like, I mean, and that's what got us into the whole domino theories of Korea and Vietnam, which is like,
right.
communism is just like, we've got to intervene before they, and then obviously those turned into kind of disastrous
Well,
things because it just
even
doesn't
like
end.
giving arms to Afghanistan, defending against Russia. I mean, and that
uh,
created a whole nother thing, you know, where it turned against us. And I guess the
yeah,
same thing that
and Iran Contra and on and
we
on and on.
supported Iraq. We funded, like, we supported
Yeah.
Iraq, it's Iran,
I,
and then
yeah.
Iraq, it turned against us. So it kind of is true. It's like violence, even if you think it's just, it always seems like it turns against you.
Yeah. But it
People
is,
violent against you. Yeah.
impossible for us to imagine Jesus of Nazareth, may have, begun to imagine something different, but it's still to this day impossible for us to imagine having a stable government that didn't use violence to keep its authority and to it's not maybe even necessary for in order to oppress. It's to like keep stability, or however it's presented. How do you rule without government sanctioned violence, from anywhere from police to the military to anything?
Yeah.
Like how do you
Yeah.
keep order?
In chapter 12, the author examines how first century Jewish leaders and crowds practice organized, nonviolent resistance against Roman control, drawing on historical accounts from Josephus. Leaders like John the Baptist, Theodos, and the Egyptian led movements that symbolically reenacted past biblical deliverances, like the Exodus and the return from Babylon, hoping God would once again free Israel from Roman rule. Alongside these prophetic movements, everyday citizens staged massive, well timed public sit ins to protest Roman action without resorting to weapons. This chapter contrasts Josephus' personal view that God supported Rome and that resisting Caesar meant resisting God, with the historical reality that first century Jews actively developed a powerful strategy of peaceful, unarmed opposition to challenge imperial authority.
Yeah, so the most interesting example that he gave that I wasn't aware of is that Caligula, famous emperor, notorious emperor, wanted to put Roman standards, icons, maybe into again following in the footsteps of Antiochus, who had been a Greek leader before Roman rule, and put these things into the temple. How much proximity can Rome have to this religious institution? So what you have to do as Josephus is you have to deny the political ramifications of what's going on there at the temple. Because like again, they hadn't separated very clearly, even in the Jewish community, this forced a separation. But in Rome and the Jewish community, the separation between politics and religion was not clear. And so,
Mhm.
whereas Caligula might have even seen it as a political slash religious thing to go and put the Roman images, standards, icons in the Jewish temple as a sign of domination. This just forces this sort of like issue, but like come down there and like bring all the crap and put it into the temple, under threat of violence. He basically reports back that they were met with all these Jews who were willing to die, that not happen, that kill us or whatever, we're blocking the way, you're going to have to.
Hmm.
They were willing to sacrifice their bodies, but they weren't fighting them. They weren't like, which would have been what you would expect, from stuff from previous episodes, like stuff in Maccabees, for example. Like, what they were just putting their. This is like perfect example of what we would call nonviolent resistance. Not just putting their bodies in the way of the Roman
Hmm.
troops as they, were marching toward the temple to defile it. So the question, and it's really ambiguous, is like how much were they rejecting Roman authority in a political sense, and how much were they rejecting the Roman sort of like religious imposition on their own religion?
Hmm.
And so you have to like figure out like where this separation is, and it wasn't clear. And I mentioned last time Jonathan Z. Smith kind of like explaining this, one of the first people to explain how, ironically, because of religious fervor, in a sense, the early Jewish and Christian communities invented secularism, or even the idea of a public space where you don't you separate in those spaces politics from religion. So because Jesus doesn't have one of these coins in his pocket when he's asked about the coin and about paying taxes, because that was the whole issue going on there. He has to ask for a coin. John Dominick Crossan like makes this real clear. He wasn't carrying one, so like he's not saying in a very clear way like you should or should not pay your taxes, either accepting or denying Roman authority. In Luke, when he's asked, are you the king of the Jews? He says, you say that I am. And so
Hmm.
he's kind of like hedging on the question, like, but then in John, when asked the same question, he says, my kingdom isn't here. So he's like, he's trying to, totally, say like you, it doesn't affect, Rome, or Rome's political authority in any kind of way.
In chapter 13, the author argues that Pontius Pilate's decision to execute only Jesus, while leaving all of his followers unarrested and unharmed, proved that Rome viewed Jesus as a nonviolent political agitator rather than an armed rebel. According to Roman judicial practice, violent uprisings were crushed by executing leaders alongside their supporters, whereas nonviolent leaders were executed alone on the assumption that their movements would fade away. Placing Jesus within a broader first century Jewish tradition of peaceful activism, the text shows that Jesus did not invent nonviolent resistance, but rather practiced an existing strategy of unarmed opposition against Roman imperial power. Ultimately, gospel parables in Mark and John highlight this sharp contrast, presenting God's kingdom as a nonviolent struggle for justice that directly confronts the violent domination of Caesar and the kingdoms of the world. You read about the life of Jesus in the Gospels, and sometimes, I would think, why are they so opposed to Jesus? Like Jesus went around and healed people, showed compassion to both the powerful and the unpowerful, but yet people wanted him dead. I suppose maybe because Rome thought he was a threat.
That Jesus did not go to Jerusalem in order to have a violent insurrection or become one of those other violent insurrectionists. Sometimes people claim this kind of a thing, that it was he was a zealot and things went wrong,
Mhm.
political zealot, or a political messiah or whatever, that was trying to establish some kind of new kingdom or rule. And that what he went there to do, was to certainly proclaim the coming of his kingdom. And we talked last time about how it's one of these coming already but not yet kind of a kingdoms. And so it was taken, though, as political. And so, so he was executed. It may be helpful to backtrack a little bit with his predecessor, John the Baptist, and what was going on with the baptism bit there. So John the Baptist was sort of like why was he at the Jordan? Who saw the Jordan River as this crossing over into the promises of God and into the promises of God, into the promised land, really, and that the baptism was like this thing that makes you ready to enter into or receive the kingdom. And there is just this degree of interpretation about how political that is versus how spiritual or how religious that is, because John the Baptist explicitly preached against Herod, what Herod was doing by having assassinated I guess his brother and married his brother's sister or whatever. That he was dipping his toes into politics, and so that's why John the Baptist was assassinated. And so basically, we would call them nowadays like puppet rulers. That's what Herod was. So he was loyal to Rome, and as long as whatever political intrigue there was, in his leadership, murdering his brother and marrying his sister, that was his own business as long as he was able to keep the area under control, basically, and follow the Roman authorities. What caused all these revolts at this time? So part of it was this perception that the Jewish authorities were just puppets to Rome, and that they had accommodated too much. And so it seems like John the Baptizer was proclaiming a kind of kingdom that had political ramifications, and it clearly did because um, he was saying stuff about Herod, whereas Jesus, was not speaking in any
Yeah.
explicit way against the high priest Caiaphas or
No.
the Herodians or whoever he does, or even the Roman authorities in any explicit way, which is why this whole ambiguity around render unto Caesar is the centerpiece of this book. Is like, what is he saying? Is he saying pay your taxes or not? Is he supporting Rome authority or not? Like John the Baptist is preparing people through this cleansing ritual that has a long history, and this Jordan River entrance into the land of the Promised Land that has a clear Jewish history, about like a glorious kingdom that was vassal to no overlord or power, but was like its own, had its own dominion or whatever. The Davidic sort of a line of rulers or whatever, messianic rulers. What is being preached here is the question. Is it so? Clearly John was just executed because he pissed off Herod, but Rome knew he was doing that, and there were plenty of people doing this thing out in at the Jordan, getting baptized or whatever, and didn't feel it to be any threat. He was not killed by Rome, because he was just killed by Herod because he pissed him off, or he pissed his wife off or whatever. And in many ways, the same could be said for Jesus. Like Jesus clearly was not seen by the Roman authorities uh, as much of a threat, except that it was during this high holiday, which was a time when there was lots of revolutionary fervor. And so, like, it's like kind of like, yeah, you gotta, during this time, you gotta be extra vigilant. So you got to get rid of these guys as they pop up, just so that there's not a huge scale violence. Because during
Yeah.
these holiday journeys into Jerusalem, and again, John Dominick Crossan doesn't think he goes into Jerusalem just once. He thinks he goes into Jerusalem multiple times. And so they knew who he was, but they didn't execute him any other time. Why did they execute him this time? Because it was during this really tense time when it was easy to whip people up into zealotry.
So he was a threat in that he did get people worked up, because there were times when he had to leave the masses because they wanted to make him king.
Right.
I'm not quite. I don't remember the passage.
No, that's right. Yeah, that's right.
Or Judas tried to corner Jesus so that he would kind of start possibly a violent revolt. So
Yeah.
Judas wasn't sure.
How do you interpret, for example, how do you interpret entering Jerusalem from the east on a donkey versus the Roman emperor entering with his whole retinue and a horse in a triumph from the west. Is he trying to say like I'm going to overturn you, or like I'm a totally different thing than you, or my kingdom? That's the question that that we're asking. When we ask, what do we owe Caesar?
Well,
Like
and nonviolent resistance is a threat.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
Martin Luther King, our government thought he was a threat,
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
So,
So yeah,
um,
again, like the idea here is that it's if it had been like an armed gang, they all would have been put to death.
right. He
But
wasn't
because it was
nonviolent.
this yeah it was this sort of nonviolent resistance to Rome, or at least counterpoint to Rome, that Jesus was offering, sort of ambiguous, like how much of a counterpoint was this. Did this include a spiritual or a political or both kind of a kingdom? Again, that separation had not been made clearly at this time, and so like they probably didn't see it as a threat politically at all, but they did see that it was this time of heightened danger,
Hmm.
and so the holiday season, and a lot of crowds, a lot of people. The potential was just kind of like a let's not risk it sort of a thing. This guy seems
Right.
to be causing a lot of problems, whatever his agenda is. So we need to, get rid of him.
As well as religious leaders were accusing him of things
Right. Yeah. It's like,
as well. I do have a quote from this chapter. Um, but the Markan parable, two prisoners indicted for resistance to Romanization and offering the crowd its choice, Jesus being nonviolent or Barabbas being violent. The crowd chose the wrong liberator, Barabbas. And God versus Caesar morphs into Jesus versus Pilate, which morphs into nonviolent resistance versus violent domination. I mean, it seems like Crossan believed that Jesus was a activist. So, what was Jesus hoping to create? What was the
yeah.
end game? Was it
Yeah. So it has
just
to do with the distributive justice bit. This is the reason why John Dominick Crossan
yeah?
goes into Genesis and talks about
But he
just
has
Sabbath and
no
the meaning of Sabbath.
but
Yeah.
he has no vote. He has no influence on what Rome
Right.
does. Was he
Right. So
trying
his
to
only way is
reform
to,
Judaism?
yeah.
Maybe,
Well, yeah.
you know?
His only way is to, I guess you could say, like preach, yeah, a different kind of kingdom. So one that is
Yeah.
based on Sabbath values found in Genesis, Jubilee values, if you will,
Yeah.
redistributive forms of justice. And this whole idea around equality that you kind of see where people are treated fairly, basically. And where did he get that from? So that's why John Dominic Crossan goes this whole thing like, where does he get these ideas from? And he just from his Jewish tradition thing. He's trying to take his values, his Jewish values of justice, redistribution, and equality. That's which are, depending on how you consider it, they're either they are against Rome, to the point where they could be a threat to Rome, but a nonviolent threat to Rome. Or it might just be that the message of equality and redistribution and justice was just by its very nature a threat to Rome.
And of course, we see in authoritative regimes is different ideas are a threat.
I mean, what John Dominic Crossan calls Sabbath ideas, like
Yeah.
this, they were a threat because it recognizes the equal dignity of all people. I
Right.
mean, because
Right.
the day of rest and all this other kind of stuff, the releasement of slaves, the releasement of debt, all that kind of stuff, that doesn't necessarily make a Roman economy run real great.
And I did look up distributive justice, and there was a YouTube video describing it. So I don't know how accurate it is, nor I don't know if it really applies to Jesus's day, but it basically it doesn't necessarily mean socialism. It
Right.
could mean it could be done in a capitalistic economy, but what it does try to do is have policies that give all people opportunity,
Yeah.
as well as certain, social welfare, systems, um, to help the
Or just straight
disadvantaged.
up redistribution. Yeah, yeah.
Right, right. So it
When
doesn't
things become too
necessarily mean
radically unfair.
socialism.
Yeah.
Yeah. In chapter 14, the author contrasts sanctioned theology, the traditional view from Deuteronomy that God acts as a strict judge who externally rewards the obedient and punishes the disobedient, with Sabbath theology. Instead of transactional rewards and punishments, Sabbath theology reveals that God's fundamental character is distributive justice, symbolized by a weekly rhythm of rest, debt relief, and equality, where God gives rain to the righteous and unrighteous alike. Rather than seeing suffering as a direct divine punishment from an angry God, Sabbath theology teaches that negative human consequences stem eternally from failing to live out God's inherent design for fairness and shared well being.
Transactional religiosity versus like grace religiosity. So this is just
Mm-hmm.
like, yeah, in some ways it's, this whole faith versus works thing, although all these things are extremely, tied up with a long history and very problematic at this point. So we'll just try to disentangle this as much as possible. So like, I mean, just the idea of forgiveness of debt, okay? That's the grace theology, right? But it's still, this is, John Dominick Crossan mentions this is how Jesus begins his ministry, quoting, Jubilees and
Mm-hmm.
this what John Dominick Crossan I think rightly calls Sabbath theology. You can sort of see that, yeah, he did seem to be preaching something like that. Like how whatever
Mm-hmm.
ins and outs there are, that's at least the message that some people, his closest followers, including Paul, have got. That's what the community of Acts is living out. This kind of, well, that's not what they're living out according to Paul, because Paul has to write some nasty letters to them to treat each other equal and to distribute equally and all that kind of stuff. But like that's the goal at any rate of the poor there in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And so like what was being preached is opposed to the idea of rewards and punishments, which is a lot of times like tied up in the theology of of all of the Pentateuch.
Mm-hmm.
Beyond the Pentateuch, we'll just say the whole Hebrew Bible because I want to include the prophets and I want to include wisdom and all that kind of stuff in what I'm saying. But like what's very clear is like there is this kind of competing impulse, religiously speaking. Like we're being punished because we didn't follow God's rules, and so that's why we can't have a kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
And then you see this other times, though, really radical shift to we're being punished because we don't treat the poor right. And that is almost
Mm-hmm.
exactly this shift between the Sabbath theology, which is like there are natural consequences when you do not, act. It's not God punishing you from the outside. This is what happens when you don't treat the poor right. It's just a natural consequence. It's not like, oh, you're not obeying God's laws and so you're going to be, but if you have a radically unequal society, guess what you get violent revolutions, you get all kinds
Mm-hmm.
of lack of
Mm-hmm.
prosperity, you get like a failing government, all kinds of stuff, like people who like rule on a really illegitimate basis. It's just a natural consequence. So
Mm-hmm.
like Sabbath theology is like this is how the world was made. It was made for you to be concerned about the well-being of others,
Yeah.
versus like you didn't when you went into Canaan and you violently took over the land promised to you by God. You didn't kill enough babies, and so you're being punished by God or whatever. The other altar. You didn't like worship the right idols or you didn't rid yourself of your foreign wives and their idols or whatever. Like you're being punished because you weren't zealous enough in that regard. So you can see that divide throughout the Bible. Both are preached in the Bible. It's just
Mm-hmm.
there's a shift, at least with the prophets, and Jesus is in this tradition from
Right.
that retribution type of justice versus this redistribution kind of a
Yeah.
justice where
Yeah.
you're like, you're. distributing things according to principles of Sabbath and equality and community,
Mm,
or
yeah.
and concern for neighbor or whatever.
I did highlight this quote from the chapter about this is Sabbath. The Sabbath is not a creation by God, but a state of God. It is not made by God, but lived by God. Distributive justice is not a suggestion or command of God, but the nature or character of God. It derives from God's distribution of existence in everything, and especially of God's own image and likeness to humanity. I thought that was pretty good, of just that
Yeah,
idea of
beautiful.
justice and Sabbath values and principles are just part of the character of God, and us being in the image of God, we ought to live that out
Yeah, and so
in
when
our
we're
day-to-day
bringing our
life.
religious convictions, again, we pair them back up with our political commitments, so that like we bring into the public space and our desire for distributive justice, our desire for
Yeah,
equality, and that so that we not it's not, but it's different than theocracy. It's different than Christian nationalism, because it's not this idea that, Christian nationalism would be more akin to like, we take the land of Canaan by force and we're being punished because we tolerate homosexuals or some stupid shit like that. So it's got to be that's totally rejected by Jesus. It's we you know we're if we're being punished, it's a natural consequence of not including the outcast, not including the other in our definition of who our neighbor is. That's why we're
yeah,
being punished, and it's not a punishment at all. It's just a natural
yeah.
consequence.
In chapter 15, the author contrasts Deuteronomy's sanctioned theology, which models God as a strict judge, executing rewards and punishments through a legal covenant, with Sabbath theology, which models God as a caring householder, drawing from the everyday experience from an ancient farming family where every member has an inherent right to food and care. Sabbath theology presents a God who ensures distributive justice as a baseline entitlement rather than a selective gift. Jesus builds on this vision by commanding his followers to love your enemies, which a text interprets not as passive submission, but as active nonviolent resistance to Roman imperial violence, by urging believers to view God as Abba, Father of a shared global household. Jesus reveals a creator who treats all people equally, sending sun and rain on everyone alike, and demonstrates that human suffering comes from our own selfish choices rather than an angry God getting revenge. I think we talked about all that.
Contra John of
So,
Patmos. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I just thought it was interesting how he compared it to like a household, God being the
Yeah.
household leader. Like when we give food to our children, it's not an act of charity.
Yeah, it's actually, that's
Um,
why it was important to say distributive justice, as Crossan does, rather than saying redistributive,
yeah,
which is what I was saying before, because redistribution would be something more like charity. Distributive would mean that you set it up in the first place. The family is just set up in such a way that, goods are distributed fairly. If it's a good family structure, you
a
know.
household was an experience one had by simply growing up. Feeding one's children is distributive justice by right and entitlement rather than distributive charity by parental almsgiving or philanthropy. Um, a family with half the children starving and the other half overfed is an obscene lack of distributive justice or rights rather than an unfortunate lack of distributive charity or alms.
Perfectly said. Crossan has got away with words, I tell you.
Yeah, that's why he's a popular author.
That's right.
Um, yeah,
Popular with commies.
right, right. But again,
Lefties.
distributive justice doesn't mean we can't have private ownership either.
Right,
My
yeah.
understanding. So it's kind of
Well, it would be like if you could
you
set up the
know,
markets in a fair way from the beginning,
right,
so that
right,
so that so that they get, approximate, opportunity for all, rather than set it up in a way which they are now, where it gives
yeah,
advantage to the people who already have advantage. So it just piles advantage on top of advantage.
right.
So that's the problem. And so then when you try to redistribute after that, that would be the charity thing. Like, oh, I get really wealthy, like Carnegie or somebody like that, and then you give it all back by to the public by like giving, becoming like these super charitable
Right.
donor kind of people. Man, but that's a world better than what we have now, where we just have scumbags who don't even think about giving anything of their
Yeah, and
wealth. They
it's
just
like
think
the
about
Gilded Age.
accumulation. That's it.
It's like we had the Gilded Age when people got really, really wealthy, and then the government stepped in and broke up some monopolies and
Yeah,
kind of
because
in
you
that
got to
way
intervene in the market.
redistributed
Yeah,
things, and it really helped everybody. I
yeah, yeah,
felt, you know.
right, yeah. So you can
Um,
have a
but
market, as you were saying. It's just got to be
yeah,
it's got to be regulated according to the principle of fair distribution, equality, fairness, whatever.
yeah,
It's got to be governed by ideas of justice. It cannot be governed by ideas of accumulation or mammon or whoever. Like
yeah,
this
yeah,
idea of cupidity or anything else. So
yeah. I remember someone asked me about what do you think about having a flat tax rate, and I just said, well, I believe that burdens the poor because you know 10%. Like if you make $10,000, taxing 10% on that $10,000 will affect them more than someone that makes $1 million a year. Um, and when you look at it, uh, it's actually how our tax system is set up. A flat tax is really a regressive tax, whereas the poor pays more of their share of what they make than the wealthy.
mhm.
Makes
Right.
sense? Yeah. So
Yeah. So by
yeah,
what principle are you analyzing the problem of taxation there? You're analyzing it to see, like what effect does it have on the poor, and
right,
so but of the least, and that's what is meant by how we are to look at anything. So a
right,
market can function if it doesn't overburden or disadvantage the poor to the degree of
yeah,
injustice and strangulation or whatever.
yeah,
But like but in as much as it, and you'll notice that people in favor of free market are always in favor of less regulation, less rules. Mostly because it's an advantage to them. So the question is always like, how are you analyzing this? Although I will say that there are, these free market libertarian folks who are also Christians that say that like the totally free market is the best kind of like expression of Christianity, and they sometimes use this parable of the wealthy landowner, the great vineyard owner who goes out and hires people at different times, which is considered like this sort of like a parable about equality and distribution according to the principles of equality. But the free market libertarian takes it as like, no, see what this is like the landowner wasn't, didn't have to adhere to government regulations, so he'd choose what to pay people or
hmm
whatever.
hmm
You gotta like switch it around, but it's like at that point, like the reason why I know you're wrong about like Jesus's intention and like how we should take it as Christians is because of this very basic principle. Does it create more equality or less? Period.
yeah, yeah,
Is it
yeah,
according to does it create love, or does it create suffering and enmity? So
yeah. I mean, maybe a non-economic situation was during COVID. Like, our people that are in health departments were saying to do certain things to slow the spread to protect the vulnerable, and that's something that they talked about since day one of the epidemic. Like we're concerned about the elderly, we're concerned about those going through cancer treatments and immune compromise. So what you can do, you can wear a mask. Why not think is but the response of many people were like, "Well, I'm healthy, my family's healthy. Why do I have to wear a mask?" And they weren't thinking of the person that they did not know that's going a child that's going through, or whoever going through cancer treatments where they have basically zero immunity, and they need some sort of what do you call it when everyone's vaccinated but one person's not?
Herd immunity.
Herd immunity. I mean, something like, I mean, just wear a mask. And people were just so animate about not about their personal rights. And sure, you have a personal right, but like as a Christian, I'm to consider other interests, other people's interests, and not just mine. You know, I think of a parent whose child is going through chemotherapy. I'm going to try to, you know, wear a mask to maybe help prevent. Maybe if I'm sick, I don't want to pass it on to my friend, and my friend will pass it on to their child. To me, it was Christianity 101. To me, I'm still flabbergasted in just how people responded, and just not willing to like consider the least of these, the most vulnerable. Which you said that's what we should be thinking about. How will economic policy or COVID policy, if you will, how will that affect the vulnerable? That'd be the last one.
Yeah.
In this epilogue, the author explores how the historical Jesus and early biblical texts responded to the power of the Roman Empire, offering a model for how people should view government and society today. By comparing historical declines, such as the fall of the Roman Republic driven by severe economic inequality, to modern concerns, the text highlights the danger of leaving social divides unaddressed. It contrasts the book of Revelation, which completely rejects and demonizes Roman rule in favor of a heavenly fantasy, with Luke Acts, which integrates and celebrates a combination of Roman culture and early Christianity. However, the author argues that the historical Jesus chose a middle path. Rather than demonizing or celebrating imperial power, he actively criticized it through nonviolent resistance. Ultimately, the passage suggests that true peace comes not through military strength or imperial conquest, but through distributive justice, a principle of fairness that may be built into the very fabric of human evolution and the universe itself.
Right. Yeah. This is
I
how
think
the world was made. And if you
yeah.
want to talk about intention and purpose and going against God's intentions, you go against God's intent. You go against God's intention when you impose inequality, injustice, violence against your brothers and sisters, and that's the natural consequence of that is suffering, failure to
Yeah.
thrive, collapse, all that stuff. Certainly,
Very good.
plenty of political ramifications there, and why when I think, at least when I say render unto Caesar, I don't mean we do. My political self is over here, and my
Mm-hmm.
religious self is over here. My political life is very much informed by the values that are clearly promoted in the Bible, which
Oh yeah.
which is this idea of the kingdom of God that Jesus preached straight from Genesis and through the rest of the Jewish tradition. He was just
Yeah.
he preached Jewish ideas.
Yeah.
But there were a lot of different ones, competing
Yeah. Yeah.
ideas. But
Yeah.
like he was one strain of that. So, all right. Well, another book down. That was great. Look forward to seeing you on the next one. We're going to be doing Bart
Yeah.
Ehrman and what's it called again?
Love thy stranger.
Love Thy Stranger. Wonderful.
Yeah.
All right. Well, peace and see you next time, Kev.
See you next time.